Welcome into episode 159 of The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. I'm Ken Ray.
And I'm August Trometer.
What website warnings and Tencent will get you? Security and an Internet of Things thing. And would you please join our street team? We offer benefits. Find out what those are and more on checklist number 159, brought to you by Secure Mac. News earlier this week of something that sounded really bad that may only end up having been kind of bad, or fingers crossed, not bad at all. Early in the week, Mac Rumors ran a piece saying that Apple's fraudulent website warning feature in Safari for iOS and Mac had a new partner, the Chinese internet giant Tencent. Hey, Mr. Trometer, can you tell us, please, what the fraudulent website warning feature is and how it works?
Sure. Basically, Google has a database of sites that are probably bad news if you visit them. If your browser tries to visit one of these sites, you'll get a warning that says it's a bad site. Apple uses this database in Safari to help you stay safe.
Now, I think that is actually stuff that we knew if we read the fine print, maybe. The thing is, it went from being a partnership between Apple and Google to being a partnership between Apple and Google and Tencent. So I guess the question now is, who is Tencent and why should we care?
Well, Tencent is not a rapper. That's 50 Cent.
That's 50. That's right.
Tencent is a huge corporation based in China. They're Google and a lot of other things there. But because of the way China is run, they're also an arm of the government there.
Now, part of the reason that this was so bothersome early on was because Apple hadn't said boo about it. In its early piece, Mac Rumors said it's difficult to know for sure whether Apple users residing outside of China are having their data sent to Tencent, but the company appears to be mentioned on iPhones and iPads registered in the US and the UK and possibly other countries too. And you can see why Apple's silence would be somewhere between frustrating and alarming. Then Apple finally spoke, quoting a piece from Apple Insider, following a report alleging that Safari was sending URLs to China. Apple has clarified that this is not the case and has detailed how the Safari browsing feature works. Apple also explained that it uses Google for website warning system, though for devices with their region code set to mainland China, Tencent is used. It's not a small number, but it's not as big as, say, every iPhone, iPad, iPod Touch, and Mac that uses Safari. Now, there are a couple of things that are still kind of worrisome. Apple stressed in its explanation that URLs were never sent to Google or Tencent as part of the fraudulent website warning, but we kind of knew that that was the case because of how the warnings work. Was this just Apple trying to calm the fears of folks not reading the fine print?
You know, I think so, but I'm really disappointed in Apple. China is a huge market for them, and it just feels like they're caving for dollars.
Well, caving for dollars, first of all, sounds like a game show from the 1960s. Here's where I get a little weirded out with the whole Apple and China thing. Apple is allowed to do business in China. China has its own government. If Apple's going to do business there, Apple has to do what the government there says, especially what the government there says. Here's one of the things that's great about, doing business in the U.S. versus doing business in China. When James Comey came to Apple and said, open a back door into your encryption, Apple said no. And Apple was able to go to court and continue to say no until the FBI said, you know what, we found a different way in. No worries. The way China is built, as you said, is different.
Yes.
If you're going to do business in China, if the Chinese government says, hey, do something, Apple's response, Google's response, anybody's response is, how high? Now, the reason I asked about the URL thing is because we knew from the way it was set up that they weren't sending the URLs back and forth. The problem that I have is there was something mentioned by Johns Hopkins University professor Matthew Green in his write-up on this issue. He teaches cryptography and is he's a bigger brain than mine, certainly. In his write-up on the issue, he said, at each of these requests, meaning the pinging back and forth to see whether a URL has a partial match or an exact match and whether you should stay away, at each of these requests, Google servers see your IP address as well as other identifying information such as database state. It's also possible that Google may drop a cookie into your browser during some of these requests. Sauce for the goose, as Spock might say. If Google can see your IP address as part of the fraudulent web warning process, doesn't that mean that Tencent could as well?
Oh, absolutely. Your IP address is close to your GPS location. Unless, of course, you're using a VPN.
Which you can't in China. Not legally anyway.
Right.
I know that was a big thing, I think, last year or earlier this year. Apple had a bunch of VPNs on the App Store in China, and China said, you know what we would like? No more VPNs on the App Store in China. And again, because Apple is doing business in that country, they have to follow the laws of that country. You said it's close to your GPS location. I don't know if you mean literally or figuratively. What's the potential harm of Google or Tencent or anyone else knowing your IP address?
Well, in general, the IP address will give at least a region, if not a specific location. So it may be well known that my IP address here at my home is here at my home. But it may not. But it would still be able to tell you that, I'm in California or Southern California. Tencent could potentially target people in China if they're doing searches that China doesn't want, just based on the IP address.
Now, what I found interesting is that people can turn this off. Apparently, even people in China, which I'll be honest, was kind of surprising, although I wonder if they'll be able to, in iOS 13.1. Can you tell us, though, for anybody who wants to, how would you go about turning off this feature?
Sure. You've got two choices. One, use a trusted VPN, which, as you mentioned earlier, is not legal in China. Second, you can turn this off on your mobile device by going to Settings and then Safari. Once there, you can toggle the fraudulent website warning option on and off.
And then finally, in your opinion, is this something that people listening to this? I mean, let's pretend we are actually bigger in the dance clubs than we are in China. And that's a callback to last week. Assuming that we're only talking to people, in the U.S., or assuming that we're only talking to people in the West, is this a thing that people should actually turn off?
Well, I think a trusted VPN is the best option. But if you're in China, I definitely recommend turning this off.
Okay, I don't want to use a VPN on my phone, but I want to make sure I'm secure. And I know you're saying, well, then use a VPN. But I mean, the question I have is, like, somebody listening to this, is this something we should leave on and go ahead and keep sharing this information? I mean, if I'm really sharing my IP address with Google, which, I mean, let's be honest, you probably are anyway, just by having a cell phone. But is this a thing that we should turn off for safety? Or is this something that, as long as we're not in China or, some other repressive regime, let it ride?
Honestly, my go-to is let it ride. If you're in China, that's a whole different story. But if you're here in the U.S., I think it's okay. But you have to at least be aware of what you're sharing.
As Apple Insider pointed out, you can turn it off if you want to, although if you do, you will be without Apple's fraudulent website warnings. But who wouldn't give up a bit of security for a bit of security? Let us do an Internet of Things thing. When going into someone's home, should you ask if you're being recorded? Seems kind of rude, right? Yet the opposite of that question was put to Rick Osterloh, head of devices for Google. That does, of course, put him at the head of Nest, maker of in-home cameras, among other, let's say, smart devices. A Business Insider piece points out that Google's Nest smart devices are always listening. Their microphones detect loud noises, and cameras track sudden movements in a home and can start automatically recording at any time. Now, Business Insider has word of an interview between Osterloh and the BBC. When asked by a BBC reporter whether homeowners with Nest have such an obligation, Osterloh first said he hadn't considered it. "Gosh, I haven't thought about this before in quite this way," Osterloh said. "It's quite important for all these technologies to think about all the users. We have to consider all stakeholders that might be in proximity." Stakeholders in this case would be your guests. Translation's tough sometimes. The piece goes on to say Osterloh acceded that warning house guests about Nest devices' recording capabilities is proper etiquette, stating that he already does so. Does the owner of a home need to disclose to a guest? I would, and do, when someone enters into my home, and it's probably something that the products themselves should try to indicate, he said. So Osterloh has never thought about whether Nest owners should warn guests that they're maybe being recorded when they come over for dinner, though he warns everyone who comes to his place that they may be being recorded. I can't help wondering whether one of these statements is misleading.
Yeah, seems weird to say that up front and not know that Nest is doing its thing.
Yeah, and to say that I never really thought about it before. I mean, I tell everybody who comes over that they might be being recorded, but it never occurred to me that somebody maybe should tell somebody that maybe that's happening. Listen, we bring this up not to castigate Osterloh, but to remind people that, for now, and maybe from now on, responsibility around Internet of things lies not in our servers, but in ourselves. I read an interesting article from Computer World recently that argued that we need Apple's HomeKit-enabled routers. While we wait for those, though, we still got to contend with all the Internet of things that we've already bought, plugged in, and come to rely on. Now let's go over what the HomeKit-enabled routers are supposed to do.
Well, when they're released, you'll be able to restrict access for every device so that no one outside your network will have access. You'll have different options from restrict to home to no restrictions, depending on your needs and wants and all that good stuff.
Now, something like a Nest, I get why that's a concern. I mean, we've just said a minute ago, it can record, it can video record, it can listen for all intents and purposes. Why do I care, though, about my smart light bulbs or toasters or my web-connected toothbrush?
Well, simply put, you don't know where or who an attack is coming from. If you have a smart light bulb, that might give an attacker access to your network. That gives them access to your personal data, or if you have a smart lock on your front door, they can just open it and steal your valuables while you're away.
Now, the problem with Apple's HomeKit-enabled routers, they're not here yet. And Computer World says we don't know when we're going to be getting them. On top of that, unless you're among the most security-minded people on the planet, chances are you're not going to go out and buy a HomeKit-enabled router when the router you've got, seems hunky-dory. Now, while we're waiting for HomeKit, what can we do to protect ourselves in the meantime?
Well, I always start with passwords. Don't use the default passwords for any of your devices, your router, your Wi-Fi, whatever, and always make them complex and unique. Keep up to date with your software updates because those generally include security enhancements that you will want. And for your computers, try to use a VPN whenever possible.
An appeal from us to you in a moment, but first a word about MacScan 3 from Secure Mac. Are you the go-to guy or gal for someone else when it comes to Mac security? Your mom, your dad, grandma, or grandpa? You can't be there all the time, which means you can't keep them from downloading troublesome files or clicking on suspicious links. If they've got a Mac, then you've got support in the form of MacScan 3. MacScan 3 is a great defense against malicious software attacks aimed at your Mac. It's developed by Secure Mac, trusted names in computer security and developers of exceptional security software for over 20 years. MacScan 3 detects and removes Mac malware, catches keyloggers, removes tracking cookies, and provides full range or targeted scanning, all without crowding up your hard drive or slowing down your computer. Tell mom and dad, friends and family, let the Mac users in your life know about MacScan 3 from Secure Mac. There's a free 30-day trial for everyone at securemac.com/MacScan. That's MacScan 3 by Secure Mac. 30-day trials are a safe click away at securemac.com/MacScan. We will wrap today's show with an appeal. Please tell people about this show. Or please take the information we talk about on this show and tell it to everybody you know. This isn't about us. It's about making the U.S. more savvy when it comes to their security, because right now, the U.S. is not terribly savvy about its security. I mean, you probably are. You're listening to the checklist, for crying out loud. But a piece from the Next Web says lots of Americans still confuse 2FA, encryption, they don't understand private browsing, lots of stuff that we've hit here time and time again. This is based on a study by Pew Research Center. If you're looking for good news, the message is getting through about some things. Let me ask you a question, August. Which do you think people understand more? I'm going to give you three choices. Do you think people understand more what it means when a website has a privacy policy? Do they understand places where people might encounter a phishing scam? Or do they understand what the term net neutrality means?
Oh, man, you're putting me on the hot seat. I think most people understand the privacy policy most. The other things, probably not so much.
See, I'd have thought the same thing, but no.
Wow.
The thing that people actually understand most, and this is where it's a tiny bit encouraging, it's where they might encounter phishing scams.
Good.
Which, of course, and of course, the answer is pretty much everywhere. Phone, email, text, websites.
The UPS delivery guy.
Well, that was not on the list, but here's the thing. Phone, email, text, and websites, I believe, were the options. And then there were two other choices, none of the above or all of the above. And all of the above was, of course, the right answer. Now, I say of course, but there's actually no of course about it. While that was the question to which respondents were most hip, only 67% of people got that right, 18% of people got it wrong, and 15% said they were unsure. According to the Next Web, most adults, for example, can answer questions about phishing scams or website cookies, but few, 28%, can identify examples of two-factor authentication, and just 24% understand that private browsing only hides your browsing history from other users, not from the sites you're browsing. About half, 48%, are unsure what private browsing actually does. The piece goes on to say of those surveyed, the median number of correct answers was just 4. That's 4 out of 10 questions asked. Only 20% of adults answered 7 or more questions correctly. 2% answered all of the questions correctly. Now, in fairness, one of the questions had a picture of Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey and asked people to identify him. Some bleeping hipster was not one of the options. If it had been, I might have gotten that answer wrong. I'm curious, August, did you get all 10 answers correct?
Is it bragging to say yes?
No.
There were a couple of questions that made me think, and that's a good thing. But in the end, yes, I scored 100%.
Okay. See, I'm glad to say that I scored 100% as well. But I will tell you, the only reason I did is because of the stuff I've learned for the past few years doing this show.
And some bleeping hipster was not an
Yeah, it's true. That's true. If that had been an option, I might have only gotten 90%. Here's the thing. This is why we're wrapping this show with an appeal. Please tell people about this show. Moms, dads, aunts, uncles, all the people I was talking about earlier when I was talking about MaxScan. If you hear anybody say that they don't understand something that we've discussed here, maybe somebody who says, that they use the same password for everything, or you see somebody with no access code on their phone or their tablet or their computer, please send them our way. We will try not to freak them out. We will also try to help them be a bit safer in their digital life. If they want to know what Jack Dorsey looks like, though, they're on their own.
I will say I love doing this show. I love sharing knowledge. I love being able to help people be more secure. And I'm one of those who I try not to freak people out, because there's a lot to freak out about, but there's a lot that you just don't need to freak out about. If you know somebody who just needs a little guidance, send them our way.
Yeah, we'd love to talk to them, and we'd love to hear from them as well. Of course, we'd love to hear from you as well. I think I said that right. If you've got a question you'd like to ask or a topic you would like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. If any of those people that we were talking about don't get the whole podcast thing, maybe you could send them to our website instead, securemac.com/checklist. There, they'll actually find a lot of tips on things like two-factor authentication, like choosing strong passwords and password management and things like that. And the trick is they can actually just, hit a play button there and listen as well. So even if they're not podcast savvy, they should understand a play button. Even if their VCR, yes, even if they still have a VCR, is still flashing midnight, securemac.com/checklist, and we'll try to take care of them there. All this stuff I just said, if you can't remember any of it, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.